While politics is often center stage, policy and substance will form the basis of any fiscal agreement. And we at the Peterson Foundation believe that the more ideas and the more solutions brought to the table, the better. Our initial goal was to create a platform that fosters policy proposals from across the political spectrum. If we're going to put in place a plan that can work for the nation, we need to hear the ideas from all sides. And the objective is to provide our elected leaders and the public with an array of options to consider as we address these tough fiscal choices. Our initial foray into solutions was when we launched the first phase of the Solutions Initiative. We asked the organizations to develop long-term fiscal plans, and all of them put the nation on a sustainable fiscal path. This time, we asked them to revise and update their plans, but we also asked them specifically how should we avoid the cliff and what should be the first priorities for Congress and the President in 2013. Once again, all of the Solutions Initiative groups delivered plans that would put America on a better fiscal path. While, of course, the plans differ significantly, they together demonstrate the needs to address a few key areas. The need to foster economic growth and avoid harming the recovery. The need for reforms that restrain the growth of health care costs. On tax reform, while they disagree on how much the federal government should collect, they all agree that the current system needs significant changes. And although Social Security is still a hot-button issue, all 5 groups proposed reforms that would make the system more sustainable for future generations. Our Solutions Initiative partners met the task at hand, establishing a plan that would improve America's long-term fiscal outlook while avoiding the negative effects of going over the fiscal cliff. In doing so, they provided a range of ideas that can help lawmakers on both sides of the aisle strive for a compromise on how to fix our long-term debt. When we talk about fiscal reform, no one can say that we don't know what we can do to solve these problems. The options are spelled out and clear, and these organizations help move the country to this point. So I want to thank them sincerely for their participation and welcome to the stage with their moderator, Politico's Wall Street correspondent and Morning Money columnist, Ben White. So please welcome them to the stage. Thank you.
Let's start with the fiscal cliff, and I just say who you are, where you're from, and what exactly you would like to see Congress and the White House do on the cliff, and maybe what you expect out of the meetings today. So let's start with Doug and move down the line.
Doug Holtz-Sagan, I'm with the American Action Forum, and what I would like to see, first and foremost, is a deal as quickly as possible that shouldn't drag on. The deal should extend current policy to the greatest extent possible with a commitment to do serious tax and entitlement reform in the spring.
I'm Alice Rivlin. I'm at the Brookings Institution, and I'm co-chair with my friend Pete Domenici, who's sitting in the front row, of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Debt Reduction Task Force. On the fiscal cliff, we should not go over it. It would be both economically a bad thing and a demonstration that our government isn't working. We should put in place a framework in the lame duck session that will specify that the cliff is postponed in some way, that the regular committees of Congress in the next session should bring back a plan that would meet certain targets. And those targets, this is for the big deal, for the grand bargain, those targets would be specified sort of like reconciliation instructions. And the bill that came back would follow an expedited regular order, no going around the regular committees, but it would be subject to a majority vote and no filibuster and no amendments. And there should be a fallback position, which might, at best, be something like Simpson-Bowles or Domenici-Rivlin, but would in any case be a step toward solving the problem. Not another cliff, but a partial solution.
Okay, Michael?
I'm Michael Ettlinger. I'm Vice President for Economic Policy at the Center for American Progress. You know, I think we shouldn't go off the cliff. You know, I think we should shut off the sequester. We should extend the middle-class tax cuts. We should put some money into getting teachers back to work, putting some money into infrastructure spending to help the economy get going. It's something we're going to have to do eventually. This is the ideal time to start doing it. We should extend the payroll tax holiday or do something like that. And that isn't the end of the story, as Alice has alluded to, but I think those are things we should just do right now and, move on from there.
Josh.
I'm Josh Bevins, the Director of Research and Policy at the Economic Policy Institute. In a lot of agreement here. I think we need to separate the problems. We have a real, immediate, actual problem of near-term fiscal contraction that will drag on growth, and then we have the not very imminent theoretical problem of projected long-run budget deficits. We should solve the immediate problem. One thing you can do, go to our website. We've released a paper, Navigating the Fiscal Obstacle Course. One thing you can do in the short term is end the high-end Bush tax cuts, take half of the 10-year savings you get from that, plow it into economic support for the next 2 years, and then work on the longer-run issues when they actually start to threaten to become a real problem.
Okay. Allison?
Allison Frazier from the Heritage Foundation. We really view the fiscal cliff as something that needs to be taken care of immediately. So we look towards doing no harm, extending all current tax policy for a good period of time that will allow Congress in the next session to do fundamental tax reform. So we want to see all current tax policy extended. We'd also turn off the sequester specifically for defense, take care of the doc fix and unemployment. All of those things need to be settled and settled quickly, and then have the broad framework for entitlement reform and move to that very, very quickly in the next session of Congress.
In terms of the big sticking point, obviously, is between Speaker Boehner and House Republicans and the White House is this idea of the top rate marginal income tax rate, and can it go from 35 back to 39.6? I guess, Doug, I'd ask you, is it crushing to the economy if it does do that? If it's not, say there's a move to 36%, 37%, some compromise on the marginal rate piece of it to get that massive problem over with, and everybody wants the sequester off. There's a lot of agreement in the other areas, as all of you have said, and is in your plans. Haven't we moved to a point where there can be an agreement to let those top rate tax rates go up slightly?
So again, I think it depends on what problem you're solving. If you're asking the question, what do you do between now and the end of the year, it's baked in the cake that we're going to have the surtax that was in the Affordable Care Act, 3.8% of net investment income. So taxes on the rich are going up. They'll pay more in payroll taxes as well. The payroll tax holiday is quite likely to expire. We have an economy that's not growing very well, and I'm quite worried about the impact of loading too much on it in the near term. So I would advise against it. I think it's a very bad idea. And to do it would be to have politics trump economic common sense. That's all there's going to be to it. Mm-hmm. Over the longer term, we know that in the deal we've got revenue and serious entitlement problems. And the issue there is, how do you raise the revenue? And if you can raise the adequate revenue with a broad-based tax reform of the type you saw in Simpson-Bowles, Domenici-Rivlin, that's far preferable. There is no reason to have higher marginal tax rates per se. Mm-hmm. And I think we should go there first.
Yeah. And Allison, do you think that we can get the revenue that is sort of, let's say the ballpark for this cliff agreement is, and this is assuming Republicans would accept this, $1 trillion to $1.6 trillion, or maybe $800 billion to $1.6 trillion. Can you get there without a marginal rate increase? Is there enough on the table in terms of loophole eliminations and deduction eliminations to get that revenue now?
Well, there is. I think the fundamental question is really, what's the objective? And I don't know why Republicans would be talking about raising taxes when there's no agreement on spending cuts. In my view, the real issue here is that we have a spending problem, and to the extent that revenues are low, it's because we have a growth problem. And if we're going to talk about raising revenues, first we need to solidify the economy, and doing this through tax hikes, in my view, really is the wrong way. So we're talking about the wrong problem, and if we are the wrong solution. And if we want to get working and moving together, we really need to be talking about any kind of revenues. And from my perspective, that has to happen through growth. But we need to be talking about the real problem. Revenues and spending cuts need to go together. Let's not forget that we have a Republican conservative House, and we need to talk about how we're going to go there together.
I guess Michael or Josh, on the spending cuts side.
Either one of you.
Yeah, either of you guys can jump in here and try to out-left flank each other. The question for me is...
I'll concede that.
Yeah, you concede that. We're talking about branding.
Before that happens, can I get to the right Allison?
Okay. We can play musical chairs for this whole time in this panel. It does seem like this discussion now in the cliff is mainly focused on revenues, on tax rates, and there's not a lot of talk about spending cuts. Shouldn't there be, and what is a fair number to put into a fiscal cliff agreement along with however they get to this revenue increase that both sides seem to basically agree that revenue needs to be there at a certain level, shouldn't there be more talk about spending cuts right now as part of this fiscal cliff discussion, and how much should they be?
So Josh is going to outflank me here effortlessly. I think, one, we've had $1.7 trillion in spending cuts already, so I think that's important to note. The first part of this process was spending cuts. That isn't to say, though, from my perspective, that there shouldn't be more spending cuts. We just put out a plan the other day to do more on Medicare, to pull out efficiencies in Medicare, and we think you can do that without hurting beneficiaries. So we think there's more room in spending cuts. On the other hand, as I said, I also think there are things we ought to be spending more on. But yeah, you can have net spending cuts certainly in the window. That should be part of this.
Josh, what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, two things. One, we've already gone exactly where this discussion goes that is very confused, which is we have two separable problems. The fiscal cliff is a problem of contraction, so we should not be talking about closing the deficit in the next couple of years. And so, in terms of spending cuts versus revenue increases, I mean, what I would say is over the next couple of years, we should only allow those things to happen that will provide a minimal drag on economic growth in the next 2 years. And to my mind, what will provide the most minimal drag is the high-end Bush tax cuts. Those can go away without a big Keynesian drag on the economy. I mean, we're not talking about like the extended unemployment insurance and the payroll tax holiday much, and those impose a much bigger drag in the near term than the high-end Bush tax cuts. I think in the longer run, I mean, the principle of our plan was to recognize what we think is the most important economic context of the past couple of decades, which is a staggering rise in income inequality. Top 1% accounts for more of average income gains over the past 28 years than the bottom 90%. And so, yes, we think revenue increases should be very progressive to reflect that. And we also realize that the key social insurance programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, they've been the only source of economic strength and security for low and middle income households over that time period. We should not start whacking away at those things when the rest of the economy has performed so poorly for those families.
Yeah, sure, Doug, please.
I get worried when this starts out as a numbers problem and a budget problem. We're going to hit this target on revenues, this target on spending, because it invites bad policy. Right? The sequester is terrible policy. It was there to hit a number.
Right.
And so, the thing that we tried to embed in our plan and the thing that I think ought to be the focus should be reforms of these big spending programs so that their structure is durable over the long term and they don't generate these enormous deficits. Reform is far more important than cutting, and that should be the imperative.
Yeah, I agree, and as well, I think that's important on the tax side. So right now what we're looking at isn't really a pro-growth or what's best for the economy kind of solution. We're looking at hitting arbitrary revenue targets, and we really need to be thinking on both sides of the budget, what is best in terms of fiscal policy for spending and particularly entitlements. I think there's a lot of weaknesses and a lot of challenges in entitlement programs. For example, they're not a real safety net. Too many Americans on Social Security today live under the poverty level because of their benefit. Let's strengthen that. Okay? Too many Americans have to go out and buy Medigap insurance under Medicare. Let's fix that. So we really need to be talking about reforms that make these programs on the spending side affordable, sustainable, and strengthened.
Alice, you had a thought there.
Yes, I think we're all trying to move you on to the longer run reform,
Yeah.
and that's right.
Yeah.
I think we can all agree that the economy is growing too slowly right now, and that the main point over the next few years is to get the economy growing faster. And there are a couple of things you could do about that. One is not go over the cliff and go back into recession. And the second is put in place a strong grand bargain that does the two things that have been mentioned here, broad-based reform of the tax code that remains progressive, arguably is more progressive, and slowing the growth of entitlements. You can't get there unless you do those things, but you can't get there too fast. And in our plan, we put up front an additional stimulus to show that we realize the economy is not growing fast enough right now.
Right. Well, let's
before
quickly.
we
I want
get
to
to
see
long
that
run?
we can go long run, but I want to see the answer to this question posed to the audience on how they think we should get to serving the long-term fiscal challenges. Spending cuts alone, cuts in revenue incomes above $250,000 only, spending cuts and revenue from middle and upper incomes. Let's flash up the results, see what people had to say about that, because I can see them here, but you all can't see them up on the screen, or do I have to give them to you? It looks like spending cuts in revenue from incomes above $250,000 is 33%. Spending cuts in revenue from middle and up, all three, 50%. So there does seem to be a lot of consensus for sharing the pain more broad-based, which is interesting to me. And I guess maybe that reflects the fact that's what needs to happen.
You can't, the arithmetic drives you there.
Right.
If you're serious about solving the problem of stabilizing the debt, there is no other answer.
Well, now, I would challenge that because our plan does actually balance the budget where we go very aggressive because we think we have a tremendous problem with debt and spending, and we do it entirely on the spending side. And I know we're the only ones
But you
who
assume
do that.
growth that gives you more revenue.
We do assume growth because we have a very bold, sweeping, fundamental, growth-oriented tax reform plan that makes it much more easy for every American, including those at lower income levels, to save. And we think we proceed right away with entitlement reforms. Now, because one of the keys to getting stronger growth is actually reducing this debt overhang that we have. And there's no doubt in my mind that that is having a negative impact on the economy today, as is the fiscal cliff.
Okay, I want to move on to the specific elements of each of your plans, but before we do that and leave the cliff, I'm not entirely clear on how you put a mechanism into an agreement that forces this action that everybody seems to want on. Everybody talks about fundamental tax reform, fundamental entitlement reform, great ideas, everybody wants to do them. We never really get there. Our last move was this sequester that now everybody hates.
Right.
So what goes in? What do we do? How do we make that happen?
So two things. First thing, to get it done, you can't go over the fiscal cliff because we are going to go into a recession, and it's a cliff, not a slope. You're wrong. Don't write that again.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm willing to bargain on a hillock is where I'm.
Okay.
Steep slope.
But
You can't
say it's
do
a
it
cliff because of market reaction.
Financial market reactions will be severe. You can't unwind them. It's a mistake. And we'll go into a recession, and we won't fix deficit or debt problems in a recession.
Okay.
So the short run actually damages our ability to deal
Fine.
with the long
So
run.
you don't want the
don't go
cliff.
there.
Right.
Then, we got to deal with the...
We do, but what is the forcing mechanism?
Here's the forcing
What I'm asking.
mechanism. If we don't do this between January and August 2013, we won't do it in 2014. That's an election year. We won't do it in 2015. Maybe. Better chance, but not in 2016. So if we don't do it in the honeymoon period of a new administration, a new Congress, we're done until 2017. Financial markets are not going to put up with that. So
Okay,
it's
so
do or die time.
We come around the cliff, but how do we get to the next thing?
Well, I think
It's the debt limit.
Yeah.
we are in a different situation.
Let's not do that.
No, let's not do
Please.
let's not do the debt limit. We are in a different situation, and I think there is no forcing mechanism that will make the political system face up to this problem if they don't want to. You have to believe now they want to because they realize they put it off for a long time. We have a re-elected president. We have a new, partially new Congress, which is much more aware of the problem and of the need to compromise. And here is the moment to get it done.
Sure. Okay. So there's the moment to get it done, but I'm still not quite clear if you can legislate something in the fiscal cliff.
Well, I described what we thought should be legislated earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, two things. One, I think you need to do something in this period that's some sort of down payment now. You can't just say, like, we're going to do this mechanism and then have happen. I actually think, look, if there's some deal, if there's something, we're going to do tax reform in 2013, and if it doesn't, something bad happens, whatever. Look, you can design all sorts of forcing mechanisms, but I agree with Alice. Like, there has to be a will to do it. I mean, the country has passed legislation for a couple of centuries without having cliffs and forcing mechanisms, right? So just the question is whether, the Republicans and the Democrats, President, Congress can come to an agreement. And I think there's maybe perhaps too much focus on, like, the forcing mechanism in this period, because in the end, it's just whether there's the will to do it or not.
Right.
You agree with that?
Absolutely agree.
I mean, no. I mean, a couple things. I mean, one is we should absolutely not hold solving the immediate problem hostage to putting in some trigger that will force us to solve the long-run problems.
Right.
The near-term problems are imminent. They're real. Everybody agrees they will slow the economy down. Let's solve them. The other problems are not imminent. They're far off. And then, I mean, part of the complaint here is, there seems to be no forcing mechanism. I mean, there's supposed to be a forcing mechanism if budget deficits are actually harming you.
Right.
And the complaint seems to be they're not harming us. Shoot, there's nothing that's making us solve this problem that is not harming us. Well, it's really hard to argue that we absolutely need in the next 2 months to lock in something when there's no evidence at all that the large budget deficits projected in the future are actually harming us right now. And you can argue that, like, in the early 1990s, there was a real market signal that led to some of that deficit reduction was interest rates actually started to go up. People actually believed that the deficits were bidding up the cost of borrowing and were really damaging the economy.
Right.
And we don't know when that is actually going to kick in, but there's no reason to sort of fight against this hypothetical imminent increase right now when we've got a more pressing problem.
Right. Well, the only advantage that we have, I'm sorry, Alice, the only advantage that we have is that we're really in a better situation today than Greece and Southern Europe is. And that's what's helping us, in my view.
Right, but I mean, is it really fair to compare us to Greece or Southern Europe, given the size of our economy and our growth rates? And could go ahead.
Only in this sense. I think Greece is a very different situation. But Spain, France, Italy, they all knew that they had problems coming, and they thought, we don't have to solve it now. We can go on borrowing, and you can't count on that forever, and we are not going to be able to count on it forever.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, Douglas, you don't agree with the idea that this is a phony problem, that the deficit and debt will look even better next year as the economy begins to improve somewhat and the debt to GDP starts to go down, that we're freaking out about a deficit and debt problem that don't really exist.
The problem is it won't. I mean, any sensible projection of the next decade says the debt to GDP ratio continues to go up, and we're already north of what has historically been the danger line. So the idea that somehow we are so special and so exempt from the laws of either arithmetic or economics that we can simply defy common sense is just wrong. And it's dangerous to think that way.
And it doesn't mean immediate austerity. That's the other lesson of Europe.
Right.
Austerity in a weak economy is a bad thing to do.
Right.
The lesson of fixing these things around the world is you, in fact, want to focus on cutting transfer programs. You don't want to cut back core functions of government, national security, basic research, infrastructure, education, things like that. In the U.S., that means you focus on entitlements and you stop trying to slash the discretionary spending programs. You just can't get there that way.
Right. All right. So let's just do a thought experiment. We get past the fiscal cliff in whatever form that we do. It's my assumption that we do, and we get into the next Congress with a Obama in his second term, Republicans somewhat less powerful in the House but still in control, Democrats in the Senate. We know the situation. You have your plans here that have multiple sort of wish lists of things you'd like to see on health care reform, Social Security reform, tax reform. Not all of what you want to get done is going to get done. Let's start at the end and pick out one critical thing from your plan that you think is the most important agenda item for the next Congress and administration to do to help the economy and the debt problem.
Well, I guess from my perspective, it really is tackling entitlements and improving the economic security that today's seniors can get and the future seniors can get from these programs. Talked a little bit about that earlier. And to me, if they're only going to do one thing next year, that would be to focus on health care. I think that health care is the most robust, the most talked about. We've got the most ideas and discussion, and the American people are most willing and ready to consider changes to health care. So from my view, that would really be changing Medicare to fix the finances. So rather than taxing the rich more, what I would do would be to reduce their subsidies, make them pay full premiums. If you're a very wealthy or affluent senior through Medicare, that can help fix the finances, and then gradually transition to a more market-based, patient-centered approach, like defined contribution, premium support, whatever you want to call it. And we would maintain fee-for-service as it exists for seniors today. Give them that option to keep what they've got. Give them the option to change if they want to as well. I think that's absolutely crucial. We've got to also tackle Medicare, or Medicaid.
Josh, from the EPI perspective, what's the critical thing to do in the next Congress, the first thing?
I mean, first is ensure a full economic recovery.
Okay.
Just,
That sounds good.
The boom, not the slump, is the time. If and only if we make that full economic recovery, and then we do want to get to work on closing budget deficits. I mean, one thing, recognize the context of the staggering rise in inequality and make a lot of this hinge on raising revenue progressively. There's this conventional wisdom that taxing the rich just can't get you very far. It's not true. They take an extraordinarily large share of total income growth over the past 28 years. And there's lots of ways to tax the rich besides just hiking their marginal rates, although there's even more room for that than most people think. I would also say, in regards to the health programs, I mean, everyone knows that it is the failure to contain system-wide health costs that really drive the long-run budget deficits out of control. We do some very easy, low-hanging fruit stuff, strong public option, bargaining for Medicare prices. And then we say, you know, there were a lot of promising cost control reforms in the Affordable Care Act. Let's actually give that some time. Healthcare costs were actually falling a bit even before the recession hit. So I actually think we've done some legislation. Let's see if it actually bears some fruit. And then finally recognize, as Doug said, you know, we should not be cutting public investment. I mean, the whole reason why you cut budget deficits in a full employment economy is to preserve your private capital stock. To preserve the private capital stock by cutting the public capital stock is really perverse.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Moving on down the line to Michael, what is your...
So one thing I'd just say to Allison is that if the public is ready to deal with health care costs right now, the quality of American political consultants is terrible, given all the ads that were run in the last campaign, trashing any politician who tried to move at all on health care costs. As to, you know, what I think the most important thing to be done, I think the most important thing, I actually think the most important thing to do is, is getting our public investments right. I absolutely think that. But the constraining thing on that is not the will to do that. There's actually a lot of support for a lot of the kinds of investments that, people want to make. I mean, there's people vary on how much and what they think is optimal, but I think there's a fair amount of agreement on that. But the constraining factor is the revenue. I mean, that's what's constraining us from doing that. So I pretty much agree with most of what Josh said, that we need to reform our tax system and we need to get more revenue, and most of that revenue should come from the top. I mean, you look at all the uproar about how much, just letting the Bush tax cuts on people making over $250 would raise, and all the uproar about that, that's like, if you look at the rate of growth of the income of the wealthiest 1%, they get that back in like a year already. I mean, it's just not that money when you compare it to the rising inequality and the growth of incomes at the top. So I do think that has to be a focus, but in service of trying to make the kinds of investments that we really need to do.
Okay. And Alice, do you have a number one?
No. It is of the essence of this problem that there is no number one. There are two main things that have to be done. Reform the tax system, and we offer a really drastic broadening of the base, which would be more progressive. It would raise more revenue from people at the top, but not by raising their rates. And I think that's feasible, and Simpson-Bowles came out there too. But we need more revenue and a better tax code. And the other thing we must do is slow the rate of growth of the entitlements, especially the health entitlements. And I think there's a good compromise there too. We need to in force all of the things that are in the Affordable Care Act that move toward changing the rate of the way Medicare is reimbursed, the way providers are reimbursed, to incent higher quality and more efficiency. But we also need to rely on markets. And we would give seniors a choice between a reformed traditional Medicare and competition on an exchange among integrated plans, fully capitated health plans. And we think those two things together are the real necessities. Now, we also had a discretionary freeze, as did Simpson-Bowles, but we've done that. That was in the Budget Control Act. We don't need to do more cutting on the discretionary side.
Okay. Douglas, you talk a lot about in your plan and the changing the tax code entirely to this consumption-based tax. Talk us through that a little bit, how that would work, and why you think that's a good idea.
Well, I mean, basically what you want to do is have a tax code that raises the revenue, does it with good growth incentives, and is simple. And this does that. What it does is it basically turns the entire tax code into a traditional IRA. If you save or invest, you get to deduct that up front, and then when money comes out, you get taxed. And that means just coming out being taxed at the same rate for dividends, interest, capital gains. You get away from a lot of the tax planning and inefficiencies from that. we keep the top rate at 35%. We raise enough revenue that, in fact, you can have a tax cut in the future. And this is the kind of tax system we need that'll promote growth because, the tax policy can be used to do a lot of things. You can have social objectives. We do that with charitable contributions. You can use it for social objectives, fairness objectives. You hear that a lot. But the paramount issue of our moment is growth, and we should have a tax code that reflects the problems the economy has. So that's where we should go. And in terms, if I just want to weigh in on that previous question, I'm with Alice. I mean, you really can't pick one thing out. And we have our tax reform, we have our entitlement reform. We think they're the best, but those things have to be done and done quickly. We don't have the luxury of pretending we can pick this silver bullet and it'll all be fine. We don't have that. We've got to take this on. These are big challenges.
I wonder, Josh, what you think of the idea of the consumption tax versus the income tax, and the fact that the idea that it can be progressive in just the same way. Do you think that's true, false?
No, I don't think you can get the progressivity of revenue. Obviously, our plan is much more progressive than Doug's, and part of that is because of the way we go about it. I mean, I'll push back on two things. I mean, we absolutely want taxes to be supportive of growth. I mean, we stole some ideas both from past EPI authors as well as Bipartisan Policy Center, and we institute some negative tax rates on a big swath of low-wage earners, so that's going to increase their labor supply. That's pro-growth. And also, I would just note, the period where we've seen this huge rise in income inequality that has just been made worse by changes in the tax code since 1979, it's actually been a period of slower overall growth. And so this idea that, increasing progressivity of the tax code is something that's just going to stomp out growth. I just don't see it. It is just not a first-order determinant of it. Much more important to my mind is public investment and a well-run social insurance system that actually allows you to constrain health care costs. And so I think the idea that the tax reform is the way to get growth through budget policy is just not quite correct.
Can I just also say that I think the idea that you're going to avoid tax, you're going to simplify things and avoid and get rid of sort of tax avoidance mechanism by a progressive consumption tax. I mean, what you're doing is you're replacing some, different pieces of loopholes and creating a giant one loophole that you can try to shift money in. And I think, the IRA analogy is apt. And if you look at, this isn't a shot at Mitt Romney, but if you look at the tax return he released, a big hunk of the way he was manipulating things to lower his tax liability was, in fact, through a big IRA. So, I don't think that's right.
If I could, I think the most, the thing to think about is not so much the rate structure. We have a progressive rate structure. It's 15, 25, 35.
On consumption,
we can fight about that, but it is the base that matters, and that's where you get the important tax policy decisions. This is a broader base than we have right now. Most of what we do now is subsidize consumption through the tax code, which is highly inefficient. So it's a much broader base. You can actually raise a lot of revenue. We raise too much, in my view, in the long run. But the tax code should also mean something, and this taxes people on what they take out of the economy. It does not tax them on what they contribute, and that's the right way to orient the tax code.
Well, and if I
do that.
Yeah, and if I could just, ours is a consumption tax on income as well. We go about it in a little bit different way than Doug's, and we don't have a progressive tax. We disagree on that, but ours is all about not taxing people from what they put into the economy, allowing people to save, incentivizing them to save, you could say, and that applies whether you're Mitt Romney or somebody who is just starting out. And I think that's important. I think that's especially important.
Yeah. Can I just say that on consumption, the
Let's
base
let
of
Alice weigh in. She was about to answer.
I think that a progressive consumption tax could work, and we could move there eventually. But there is this problem. You have to start from where you are. And we have been with an income tax for a long time. And people will say, look, I paid income tax on this, and now you're saying I have to pay again when I consume out of my savings. So there's a big transition problem there.
Right, and you would
it's not even
address
possible
transition as a real issue.
to make it happen.
Well, that is it is a non-trivial exercise. But but I would just say, look, when you start with a consumption base, as Doug said, the base is what matters. It is, as a practical matter, impossible to have a tax system that is as progressive as the income tax system we've had, simply because, the wealthy consume such a smaller percentage of their income than do middle and low income people. So it can be progressive, but it can't be as progressive as you have in an income tax. And I just say, we could argue about the economics over and over, but I would just say that demand matters too.
Okay. Well, we only have 8 minutes left, so let's move on to some other subject areas. Particularly, we haven't talked about Social Security yet. I'd just be interested in each of your plans, proposals for Social Security. Are we at the point where we need to means test, change CPI, raise the eligibility age? Doug, where do you come down on
Yes.
Social Security? All those things.
No, the answer is yes. And we should do it right away. I mean, I, as a matter of the substance, think we need to do tax and entitlement reform next year. But if you were going to do one thing, do Social Security reform.
Yeah, okay.
It's really easy.
Right.
It would send exactly the right signal to international capital markets. We can take on what is traditionally the third rail of American politics. It has zero near-term austerity impact, so all that chatter goes away. And it's a disservice to have the system we have now, where we say to people, here's our retirement plan for you. Somewhere in the middle of your retirement, we're going to slash your benefits across the board 25%. Have a ball. That's a disgrace.
Yep.
And so this is something we should do quickly, and involving all of those things is sensible.
Okay, Alice?
I agree with that, and it involves all of those things, including raising the cap on the tax and putting in another bracket, another bend point, so that it's slightly more progressive than Social Security already is. But the main point is do it now because people need to know that it's going to be there for them. And the people who say, it won't run out of money until 2037, people who are retiring in 2037 are already in the labor force. They need to know that Social Security is there for them.
And then raising the cap, do you have a place where you'd like to put it from where it is now?
It ought to cover at least 90% of income and get there gradually.
Okay.
So first of all, I disagree that there's an urgency to deal with this now. We do have a Social Security reform plan, which we don't raise the retirement age, but we do take off the cap on the employer side of the payroll tax, and we do add a bend point in the curve at the high, and we also shore up benefits at the bottom.
Yes, so
among
do we.
other things.
So do we.
Josh, where are you guys on that?
We scrap the cap. We do not cut benefits. And I'll say just a couple quick things, not through a chain CPI or anything. I mean, one, the Social Security problem is a one-time level shift, utterly manageable problem. It is completely separate from the healthcare problem where you've got the problem of containing system-wide healthcare costs. And so this is not something that's going to snowball. We can just deal with it once. We deal with it by scrapping the cap. I'd also say Social Security benefits in the United States, they're really stingy by international standards. I mean, we are a rich country. We can afford them for sure. And then another thing, one benefit to waiting to deal with this, frankly, since I don't think they should be cut, is you increase the number of people who are getting Social Security benefits and you actually have a constituency to keep them. So the idea that we should, pull the trigger today to do something that will cut what are actually pretty stingy benefits, I just don't see it.
Okay. Allison?
Well, sort of the opposite approach. We would absolutely. I know, shocking, right? So, okay, the first thing is we're all living longer. The older I get, the more good a thing that I think that is. But I think we ought to immediately increase the retirement age, and we should do it not just for Social Security, but for Medicare. And Congress could do that today. They could do that in these negotiations. Easy. I think it's a no-brainer. So let's go ahead and do that. You don't think it's a no-brainer, but I do. In any case, let me just move ahead if I could talk about our Social Security plan. Absolutely, a Social Security ought to be means tested, and we do that and we start phasing it in immediately in our plan. Again, we don't think we should sock it to the rich in terms of taxes and penalize them for doing well. We just don't. But I don't think at the same time that they should be getting full benefits. I don't think Mitt Romney needs to get full Social Security benefits when he retires. He's got that big IRA. So we would actually start very quickly means testing Social Security, and then we recast what Social Security is. We make it more like what it was originally intended, which was insurance against poverty. We don't want seniors to outlive their savings, and we want to ensure that they have no threat of living in poverty in retirement. And Social Security for too many seniors today does not give that. So we strengthen the benefit, but we move to a flat benefit. It's no longer income replacement. It's more of a defined contribution kind of model. It's a flat benefit. It's real insurance. It'll be there if you need it. So if you're Mitt Romney and you put all your money in with, Corzine, and you wake up and you don't have any the next day, you get a flat Social Security benefit. You won't be able to live on Boca, but you will be able to live above the poverty level. So two phases of that. And the first one is really important because it takes common sense ideas that are on the table, The right and the left have talked about them. Maybe we don't all agree, but we move into that very quickly and then slowly phase in this flat benefit, real insurance, economic security kind of model.
Okay, 2 quick follow-ups. We had Josh one and then Doug.
Just quickly, point of clarification. I mean, everyone always says we're all living longer, and that's why we can afford an increase in the retirement age. Not so much. I mean, the increases in life expectancy are highly skewed to high-income people, and so that should really inform our discussion. We can't just say everyone's living longer, and so we can all afford a higher retirement age.
Okay. And Doug, you wanted to
On the urgency issue, it has been the tradition to exempt people 55 and older from Social Security reform. Not one I fully endorse, because I'm going to be 55 February 3rd. I'm the trailing edge of the baby boom generation. You grandfather me, you grandfathered the problem. There's real urgency to doing this and doing this quickly.
I totally agree with that.
We got just 2 minutes left. I want to do a little bit of sort of predictions and prognosticating. I know you guys are policy wonks, not political analysts and handicappers, but I just want to start down the line. And first question is, do we go over the cliff? Do we not go over the cliff? Second is, do we really get fundamental tax reform and entitlement reform in the next Congress, or are we all just back here next year talking about the same thing? And you got like 30 seconds each.
30% chance to go over the
30%?
30% chance to go over the cliff. 70% chance of rationality.
20% showers.
House, Senate ready to do fundamental tax reform. White House standing in the way. We can get real entitlement reform, but I doubt it, because the president's commitment to the current structure of Medicare and Medicaid, desire to expand Medicaid, gets in the way.
Okay. Alice, what do you think?
I think we will not go over the cliff. I think we're too smart for that, both in the Congress and in the White House. I think the chances of getting a grand bargain that reforms entitlements, maybe not exactly the way we've all been describing it, but slows the rate of growth in the future, and a tax reform that raises more revenue are pretty good.
Okay, and do you think they're good because the climate is just different now? It's better, it's less partisan at each other's throats? Or?
I think the president would like a legacy of fixing this problem. And the Congress doesn't want to be seen as the impediment, the House, and the impediment to getting it fixed.
Okay. Yes or no on the cliff, and then
the one thing that I agree with Doug on exactly was exactly where he is on the odds of going over the cliff, which I put at about 30%. Okay. Look, I think but the thing I most disagree with is that the president is going to be the barrier to doing tax reform in these things. I mean, have you seen Congress lately? When we start getting into Congress and there's people talking about lowering rates, and then you start talking about the consequences of that for what you have to do to the tax base in terms of reining in itemized deductions, and you look at every lobbyist in the country that's going to come in like a ton of bricks on those issues on Congress, that's where you're going to jam up tax reform and entitlement reform.
Okay. Yes or no, Cliff? Big deal.
I think I put a higher chance of going over the cliff. I think the president is going to be very, very firm on the 250 and above tax cuts. I think the GOP in Congress is going to be equally firm. So I think we go over and then after January 1st, it becomes entirely hazy to me.
Okay. Last word comes from Allison. Look into the crystal ball.
I think there is a likelihood. I'm not going to put a number on it, but there's definitely a likelihood that we're going to go over the fiscal cliff. I'm not happy about it. I do think that the way out of this, really, when you look at, you do have Republicans and conservatives that want pro-growth tax reform, and that's the way into the future, setting aside the fiscal cliff. And I think that after that, we're going to have the incremental beginnings of some entitlement reforms. And then there's going to be peace, growth, and prosperity for everybody.
Right. And then no more panels for all of us if it all gets done. Thank you to Doug, Alice, Michael, Josh, Allison, thank you so much. And you got a train to catch, you got a plane to catch. Thank you very much. And that's it for our panel.